2 weeks ago, I began to preach on the book of Esther, which I think is most famous for the fact that the name of God is nowhere mentioned in the book. But God is in the book. The book is saturated with the presence of God. He may not be named, but he is described in terms of his sovereign activity. And there is really only one message in the book of Esther, and that is that God is sovereign. And that will emerge again and again as we go through this book, and we shall see different examples of God's sovereignty at work in the lives of these people, in the fortunes of the Jewish race, and therefore in the prospect of a Jewish Messiah. There is Christology in this book, although it is perhaps rather hidden and concealed. Now, last time we looked at chapter 1, and we found in chapter 1 6 apparently random events which nevertheless had a cumulative effect in preparing for a Jewess, Esther herself, to become queen of the Persian Empire, Queen of Persia, and the wife of the head of the Persian Empire, which was an immense empire in those days, extending from Ethiopia all the way across to India and consisting of various provinces, some of which had been nations which had been conquered by the Medes and the Persians who worked together. And those 6 events that cumulatively opened a way for a Jewess to become queen were as follows: the death of the father of Ahasuerus, the man who had, in a sense, built the great empire. And then there was the appointment of this man to the throne of the empire, which was somewhat unexpected. Ahasuerus had not been trained to take the throne, and he found himself in some difficulties. And those difficulties led to him leaning very much upon his advisors, who were actually making all the decisions. Anyway, we're talking about these 6 events: the death of his father, the appointment of Ahasuerus to the throne, the decision of Ahasuerus to celebrate his appointment to the throne by having an enormous party, which lasted for 6 months, with people and representatives coming from all the provinces in which he had representatives, of course. It was an enormous and a ridiculous party in some ways, and it was the party showing the pride of the man and his immaturity. And then part of the way through the party, when he and all his male guests, because it was a men's party, had drunk themselves into some degree of stupor, he decided he'd liven things up by getting his wife, Vashti, the queen then, to come and show off her beauty to this drunken mob. And she, quite reasonably, I think, refused to do so. That was the next event, the refusal. That was followed by the decision of the advisors to strip Vashti of her crown and put her into a commoner situation. He was no longer to be queen. That I'm going to deal with this whole chapter, not the whole chapter, the first 18 verses of chapter 2, under 3 headings, which I hope will become clearer as we proceed. And the first heading is the impetuous king. The second, the impatient council of advisors. And thirdly, the improbable queen. Now, the impetuosity of this young king had, I think, already been demonstrated in chapter 1, this ridiculous 6-month feast with people from all over the empire and a fantastic amount of luxury lavished upon them. They didn't have tiles on the floor, they had gold, real gold on the floor, gold carpets, if you like. They had marble seats and benches on which to sit and dine, and they spent enormous amounts of money on food and wine. Well, he was impetuous, and he was very impetuous when Vashti said she would not come and indulge his fancy by showing off her beauty to these mob. He was very angry at another act of impetuosity, very angry. And we pick up that fact in chapter 2 and verse 1, where we read, "After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti," that's the vanished queen, "and what she had done, and what had been decreed against her." Now, there's something very important there which is not obvious. Whenever a superior being or person remembers an inferior person in the Bible, it almost always means remembers with some degree of favor or regret. In other words, you see, God doesn't forget anything. And many times in Scripture, we are told that God remembered this one or that one. And so remembering on the part of God must have a special meaning. I may forget I have an appointment next Tuesday. God won't forget. And therefore there is no point in thinking of him remembering as being simply a lack of forgetfulness. It must be something more than that. Well, let me just read a few verses from Scripture. I had printed out starting with the book of Genesis, I had printed out the first 10 or so examples of God remembering, but also you'll notice not only God who remembers somebody in order to do them good, but there are human cases of that. So it's not just God, but most of these references refer to God. Genesis chapter 8 and verse 1, "But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided." God remembered Noah, and Noah was delivered from the flood. Genesis 9, verse 15, God says, "I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh," talking to Noah again, "and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. I will remember my covenant, my promise, my undertaking." Genesis 9:16. Again, Noah is still involved here. "When the rainbow, is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." Genesis 19, verse 29. "So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley," that's Sodom and Gomorrah, "God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived." Abraham had prayed for Lot, and God remembered Abraham and delivered Lot. Genesis 30, verse 22, "Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb." Genesis 40, verse 14, "Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this prison." Now, that's human. Joseph had done a favor to the butler who had been imprisoned, and he had forecast his release. And Joseph, still in prison, says to him, please remember me when you go free before Pharaoh, and ask Pharaoh a favor to get me out of the prison. Well, he actually forgot, but eventually he did remember. Exodus chapter 2, verse 24, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob, speaking of the children of Israel in the land of Egypt. And in Exodus 6 and verse 5, this is the last one I've got, moreover, I heard the groaning of the people of Israel, this is God speaking again, whom the Egyptians hold as slaves, and I have remembered my covenant. And I'm going to let them go free, going to deliver them from the house of bondage. Well, that took a bit of time, but I think it's necessary to emphasize this, otherwise we shan't understand it. He remembered Vashti and what she had done, and this was, notice, after the anger of the king had abated. He remembered Vashti and what she had done. Now, he's not talking about her refusal there, but of all the good things she had done whilst he's serving as his queen, and what had been decreed against her, which was the banishment from the royal status. He remembered that. He was sober now, and his anger had gone, and his impetuosity is now turning in a good direction. And he remembers her, and he starts to think about overruling the edict which he himself had issued against her. Now, that was a very serious thing, because that edict had been issued under the law of the Medes and the Persians. I'm sure you've heard that expression. It refers to something that was unalterable. We use it today to talk about something that can't be changed. The law of the Medes and the Persians was the law under which Vashti had been banished. And naturally, the advisors of Ahasuerus, incidentally, they're called young men here, but they're not boys. Young men was a kind of metaphor for servants. A boy was a servant, and so they often spoke of servants as, even though they were grown up and elderly perhaps, they were still boys, they were still servants. Sort of metaphor for servants, because these people who were worried by the king's impetuosity in perhaps wanting to restore Vashti to her former position, they said, look, we can't have this, because if we do, it will undermine the law of the Medes and the Persians, and that will create chaos throughout the empire. It will change completely the legal basis of our empire. And so we can't have that. We can't have that. And so we are told here that the attendants, the young men who attended him, his servants, his mentors, really, because they were the people who were making all the decisions, he said that they said, let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, or Shushan, that was where the king's palace was, under custody of the king's eunuch. Let their cosmetics be given them, and so on. They were going to send out this edict. They're going to get the king to sign it and send it out to forestall any possibility of getting Vashti restored to the throne. They said, let's quickly appoint another queen, a new queen, before the king gets other ideas, alternative ideas. And you see, that was an example of the king's impulsive behavior, when his impulsive anger was replaced by an impulsive wish to forgive and to restore Vashti. And there was a terrible danger. These advisors recognized that it would produce wide confusion in the empire, undermine the law of the Medes and Persians itself, and create conflicts. And therefore they issued this new directive, and they got the king to sign it. And you'll notice that it says that the king was pleased. at this new proposal that they had composed, they had invented it, of finding a new queen, and it says the king was pleased, but that word pleased doesn't mean he was delighted in the idea. All it means is that he was relieved at not having to make the decision himself, that his advisors had decided what to do. And what to do, of course, was to send out this new edict throughout the whole empire. All of those provinces in the empire were going to get this missive. Now, that was an amazing search process, wasn't it? And we have the fact that they managed to avoid the instability that would have come if the king had restored Vashti to the throne. Because as they point out in chapter 1, if that happened, then wives everywhere throughout the empire would start saying, well, I don't have to obey my husband. I don't have to do what he says. And the whole social order would be overturned. You might think of the process of the suffragettes, in which, in this country, the suffragette movement were causing all kinds of problems, social upheaval, criminal activity, and rebellion against the authorities in order to win votes for women. That was a good cause, but it caused a lot of trouble and difficulty and even death at the time. Well, you see, these advisors had something to be afraid of, and they therefore hurried in to this process of finding a new queen before the king could do too much damage. And they were in such a hurry, and that's why I've come to my second point, which is said, I've called the impatient council, a council of 7 advisors, by the way, who made all the decisions during these early years of the reign of Ahasuerus. They were very impatient because when they issued or composed this edict for the king to sign, they made a terrible mistake. Now, they were right in a number of ways. The king did need a queen. A queen was necessary in those days for ceremonial purposes, and the king would not appear on his own. He would attend a banquet or give a banquet. He would do all kinds of social activities and political activities accompanied by his queen. We see it today, don't we, in our own king and queen. It's very often accompanying the king on his official engagements. And that was necessary. That was why he needed a new queen. But secondly, there was the important matter of establishing a dynasty for Ahasuerus, who hadn't got any children and who needed a male heir, and therefore he needed a wife so that they could procreate and establish the dynasty of the king. But such was their haste that they really made a serious mistake. Because as you read this new edict, a search for a new queen, you find that the only criteria they set for a new queen was physical beauty. That was the only criterion. Nothing else. They appointed officers in all the provinces who were to find the suitable young women to be candidates to be the new queen. But what was the criterion? The criterion was they should be beautiful. Nothing else. They didn't seem to realize that most of those provinces had been city-states or even states in the round that had been conquered by the Medes and the Persians. They were not actually very friendly towards the Medes and the Persians. They were not very friendly towards the king. And there was no attempt here in seeking a queen to find somebody who had the right political thoughts and motives and was not going to be an enemy of the king. They just didn't care. She had to be beautiful, and that was the only thing they offered as a qualification. Now, you might say that was really an enlightened decision because it said that there was no distinction in terms of race or color or nationality or culture. No such criteria were added as long as the girl was beautiful and doesn't ask about education or language. And at first sight, you may think, well, that was very enlightened. It was rather like the movement today for diversity. But I'm afraid that would be a mistake to think that. It was less of a Miss World competition and more like a cattle market, because they weren't bothered at all. They were just looking for a beautiful woman who they would send to Shushan to try to be the next queen candidate for that post. And we have these errors that in their haste the advisors made that would lay much trouble for the future, or could do. But, God had his way. And the conclusion we can draw from this is that God is sovereign over human errors and mistakes. And he uses even the worst decisions of men to achieve his ends. There's a verse in Psalm 76 and verse 10, and I quote it from the King James Version because I think it's the best translation. And the quotation is very simple. The wrath, the anger, the wrath of man shall praise you, and the remainder of wrath you will restrain. God will use the errors, the mistakes, the sins even of human beings who do not know him to bring about his purposes. If there are people who are angry, they are fighting, they are warring, they are accusing, they are murdering, they are doing all sorts of terrible things, and we are told that the wrath of man shall praise God by revealing his sovereignty over these things. And the remainder of wrath, if there's anything that cannot, in fact, be used to fulfill God's purpose, then he'll restrain it, to stop it, put an end to it. And so this is something that we draw out from these ancient historical documents that is true today, is valid today. When we look around the world, when we look around our own country, we see politicians making terrible mistakes, making errors that are taking our country to unknown territory in terms of social mores and morals and other things. They're making mistakes, and we ordinary people, what can we do? We can't stop them making mistakes. We've elected them to the office, and now they are doing what they will and what they think is good and proper, but it may not be. But God is sovereign in these matters, sovereign over the sins of man, the mistakes of man, the errors of man. God will use those things to fulfill his purpose, and that is what we find here. As we move on to my third and final point, the improbable queen. And what I'm trying to show here is that from a statistical point of view, it was utterly impossible or extremely improbable that a Jewess would become the next Queen of Persia. And I think it's probably quite fun to do a bit of arithmetic now, if you'll excuse me. The Persian Empire's population in these days, at its height, was something like 50 million. We get that from secular sources. Well, of course, 50% of those are female. So there are 25 million females in the empire at this time. But then also, they obviously had to be of an eligible age. And let's say the ideal age of the future queen would be between 20 and 30. And that would represent about 1/5 of the population of women. And incidentally, I checked on the statistics today, and the world population, something like 1/6 of the world population are in this age range. And people live longer today than they did in those days. So I think 1/5 is quite reasonable. So of those 25 million females, there are 5 million to choose from in the right age group. However, there is another big issue, and that is that they must be unmarried, they must be virgins. And we have to make some assumption about what proportion of those in the right age group would be married. And I've made the assumption that is making life difficult for my argument, so only 1 in 10 of women in that age group were unmarried, which leaves only 500,000 eligible. And then suppose only 1 in 10 was regarded as sufficiently attractive physically. Well, that leaves 50,000. Now, 50,000 people were far too many to be sent from all over the empire to Shushan. They didn't have aeroplanes to fly them. Travel was by ox cart or donkey or horseback or foot. And this was get 50,000 people into one town in Persia would have been an impossible task in any kind of time frame that was acceptable. So let's suppose that only 1 in 10 was able to travel, capable of traveling that distance. And the expense, a young woman could not travel in those days alone. She would have to have an entourage, and that would have been very expensive. Hiring horses, hiring donkeys, hiring camels, paying people fees and so on. It would have been an impossible task to get some of those women, eligible though they were, to Shushan. And suppose only 1 in 10 of those could actually get to Shushan, bringing it down to 5,000. Now, the only clue we're given in the text is that there were many, in chapter 2 and verse 8, when many young women were gathered in Shushan. Now, I suppose 5,000 could be many, because the word many in the Hebrew actually carries the idea of very many. It was an optimistic many. But nevertheless, I would have thought that 5,000 is still too high a number to have gathered in the citadel at the king's palace. And so I've said, suppose 1,000 is a realistic figure of all the eligible young women to actually turn up in Shushan. And then, of course, there would be an initial inspection in the palace. They were being kept and trained and taught there. That's described, of course. They were given certain beauty treatments. They were given sort of instructions. They may have to be taught a new language and so on. So there's a lot going on for 12 months, a year, even when they arrived. And the king knows what's going on. He's kept in touch with the process. And I'm saying, out of that 1,000 people, then let's suppose that only 100 survived the initial inspection in the palace, seeing that there's a real possibility that the king was engaged at that stage. He was being told what was going on and who was good and who was not so good. And we're told, of course, that Esther was esteemed by everybody. Everybody thought highly of Esther. Well, then, of course, at the end of the day, the king actually falls in love with Esther. Now, you can't control that. People fall in love. But they do not fall in love consciously to serve the end that God desires. But you see, the end product was that a Jewess was improbably, the chances of one person, God's person, God's choice, being chosen as the next queen out of all those eligible people was very, very remote. And it wasn't, you might say, well, any Jewess would have done, but they wouldn't, because it turns out, as we shall see, that that there was another person in this team, Esther and Mordecai. Mordecai was who brought her up, and they actually worked together to defeat the schemes of the enemies of the Jews and preserve the Jewish race, and by that to preserve the promises of God that of a Jewish family the Messiah would come. God is in control, even in a very, very unlikely situation. God can bring about his purposes in spite of all the odds being against that purpose being fulfilled.